Welcome to Conversations on Conversations, the show where each week we have conversations about a topic that helps us have deeper conversations and more powerful relationships with ourselves and others. I'm your host, Sarah Noll Wilson, and I'm thrilled every week. But this week I'm also thrilled to invite Ann Tomkinson as our special guest this week. And let me give you her formal bio, and then I'll explain a little bit about how I know Ann and why I'm so excited for you all to meet her. So Ann Tomkinson, you, my dear, she's a certified coach with nearly 20 years in people operations with a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. Her work includes transforming organizational culture, leadership coaching, public speaking and designing, implementing and facilitating learning for organizations, boards, and leadership teams to bring an equity lens to systems and processes. Ann believes that when individuals experience liberation, organizations flourish. I was trying to remember when you and I met because we first connected on Twitter back in possibly 2018, 2019.
Something like that. I think the first time I met you in person was in Chicago.
Yes, at the SHRM conference, the HR conference, and we sat on the floor together.
Yeah, I think that was 2018.
Yeah. That was a long time ago.
Yeah, we sat on the floor together. Yes, I vividly remember that because I don't sit on the floor for just anyone.
And I sit on the floor all the time without thinking. But I have had a chance to get to know Ann on a personal level, and even for my own growth and development. I had the honor of working with Ann as a coach for a number of months during 2020 as she worked with coaching me and helping me with my personal growth and development and looking at the work that we were doing through a lens of systemic oppression. And, and before I bring you on, one of the things what I'm really excited about with this conversation is, this whole series is intended for us to pause, reflect, think differently about how we're thinking, how we're talking. And sometimes that's not going to always be comfortable. And sometimes there are truths or realities that we need to consider and get curious about. And so I'm really excited where we're going to dive in today, which is, really exploring the power of the words that we use. But before we do that, hi, Ann.
Hi, Sarah.
What would you like our audience to know about you beyond what I've already shared?
What I would want people to know about me, I think one of the most important things about me is my grandkids. I'm a grandmother. I have 2 granddaughters. I tell everyone that grandchildren are the best thing ever. Everyone should get some.
But it's a lot of work to get there. I want the grandkids, but I don't want the kids to have to make the grandkids.
I think that those kinds of relationships are really important. And I don't think that you have to have your own biological children or raise your own children to have those kinds of relationships. I think kids benefit from having people in their lives who pour into their lives and love them and give them attention. And that can be nieces or nephews or nibblings. That can be your neighbor's kids. That can be any children that are in your sphere will benefit from having you in their sphere.
That's a really great point. What do you love most about being a grandma?
Everything.
What's one thing? I was going to say, I don't want to have you choose. I never like to ask people to choose.
Yeah. A thing that I love is just watching them grow, right? Because when I was raising my kids, there's watching them grow and being responsible for everything. Right? And now I get to watch these little people. I was just looking at some pictures from about 5 years ago when they were toddlers, and they were so cute. And I remember that time, and I just shared a story on Facebook from 5 years ago when they were telling me the cutest little sayings. And then yesterday, my daughter sent me an essay that my oldest granddaughter just wrote in school, and she had an outline and notes and all of this on what it takes to be a good recorder player. And it was
love that
to watch from, her saying, nice nannies don't wash our faces, I don't like that, 5 years ago, to a 5-paragraph essay on what it takes to be a good recorder player and how music brings happiness. It just, yeah, it's amazing to get to have a piece of that. And yeah, I think
love
that's
that.
the thing that I love the most.
I love that. So, for those of you who are listening, one of the things that I want to share about the relationship that I have with Anne is that she has become a confidant and somebody that I reach out to when maybe I'm struggling or realize that maybe I had a regrettable event or a missed opportunity. And I know for me on my personal journey, this idea of our words create our worlds was a concept that I first learned about when I was learning about appreciative inquiry. And I want to just start there, just from the standpoint of that idea of our words create our reality. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, Anne, and why you feel it's so important for us to be thoughtful about the words we use for ourselves and also with other people.
Yeah, that's a great question. Our words create our reality, and our worlds create a reality for the people around us,
Mhm.
right? So, um, for example, well, one of the things that I do is I tell people whenever I make a mistake, because I want to. One of the things that I want to do is remove the scariness of, oh, what if I say the wrong thing, right?
Mm.
And I realized in a conversation this morning, I said something was crazy. And even as it came out of my mouth, I was like, oh no, that's ableist language. And it, it, being careful about language like that does two things. So for me internally, when I'm really careful about that language, it makes me much more aware, right? So it's not just, I don't want to use ableist language because that's offensive to people, to disabled people. I don't want to use ableist language because I don't want to think of disabilities in that way,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
But it doesn't just affect disabled people who hear me use that language. It also affects anyone who hears me use that language, because when we use, ableist language, we're telling the world that it's okay, that disabled people don't matter, that we can, minimize their experience. And I don't want to do that.
Mm.
I don't want to do that. I don't want to be that person. So, I want to be a person who's careful so that the world that I'm creating with my words for myself and for everyone around me is the world that I want to live in.
Mm. Mm. There's always moments where I'm like, can you repeat that again?
I can't. I
Because
never
it
know
was
what I have just said.
right. But that idea of I want to be thoughtful with my words so I can create the world that I want to live in, right? And for other people. And I, one of the intentions behind these conversations is also to piece out and to identify moments of practice that people can consider using in their own life. And so there's a couple that really resonate with me. One is that awareness of owning your mistakes when you say something wrong, right? Whether that is catching yourself from saying something from an ableist perspective, perhaps from an oppressive perspective, a sexist, I mean, any ism, if you will, add to it. Or maybe it's coming from a place of a stress response trigger, and you're a little sharp because you're coming in from that moment, and just and normalizing that. I love that idea of really normalizing naming the mistake, because I know there are times for me where you sit there in your head and you go, oh shoot, I didn't, oh crud. And what a beautiful opportunity, not only for yourself, but also to your point, to normalize for other people, repairing and
Mhm.
owning and acknowledging and naming. And so that's one thing I want to highlight. And the other is I love the nuances and the complexity of how you broke down that it isn't just about how we think and feel for ourselves. It's also how other people experience us and right the world we create for them, but it's also how we think and experience how we think about the world. That's a layer that is really
Yeah.
resonating for me right now. Yeah.
Yeah. You can edit this out if you want, but can I just um, challenge you a little bit. You said whether it's through an ableist lens or an oppressive lens or any of the isms, and I'm wondering why you don't see ableist as oppressive.
Oh, I
And
do.
if okay,
Yeah.
okay,
No, no, I appreciate that. I do see it as that. I just was expanding on in
okay,
addition to. Yeah.
cool.
No, I appreciate that pushback. Um, and I mean, this is why I love you. I think that's a good, I mean, it's a good thing for me to reflect on. For me, it was expanding beyond that, but that's not to say there might not be something potentially in there in an unconscious way that may not connect that. Yeah. Let me ask you this. One of the things as I was thinking about preparing for this conversation is there's a quote that's resonant for me, and it comes from Margaret Wheatley, she's an author, and she talks a lot about complexity in the workplace and leadership. And one of the quotes that she has is, "Without reflection, we go blindly on our way, creating more unintended consequences and failing to achieve anything useful." And I was curious just to, share that with you and to see what comes up for you, because the idea of being intentional with our language requires us to have a deeper level of reflection than maybe we're used to having.
Yeah, it really does. And I love that quote. I've not heard it before, but I really love that quote. I think sometimes when people think about being careful with their language, it's kind of like a checklist. Oh, I shouldn't say this because
Mm,
it's ableist or it's sexist or it's racist or it's whatever it might be. So I'm not supposed to say it, so I'll stop saying it. And that takes away the nuance of the reflection. Like, why do I say that? Why is that
mm,
so easy for me to say? Going back to my example of words like ableist words like crazy, one reason it's easy to say is because everybody says it.
mhm,
And then it's like, well, wow, why does everybody say it? Why is that okay? What, you know, it, yeah, it has to be so much more than a checklist because our words create our worlds, but we choose our words,
mm,
right? So we can just be thoughtlessly spitting things out and creating a world that we have no idea what it is that we're creating. And I think that's what the quote is getting at, right? Like if we don't
mhm,
have some reflection, then we don't know what we're creating, and we're putting things out there that I don't think that there are many people out in the world who would say they don't care about other people. They don't care if they're going around stomping on people and hurting people and causing harm. Like most people would say, no, that's not who I want to be. I want to be somebody that cares about people. I don't want to cause harm. But then they don't think about how to make that happen,
mm,
or why those intentions aren't being realized,
mm, mm,
right? So it's
mhm.
easy to say, I want to be a good person. I am a good person. I want to think of myself as a good person, without thinking like, well, what does a good person look like?
Mm,
And what makes a good person? And how do I become a good person? And then how do I understand that all of my lofty aspirations are aspirations, and I'll get closer and closer and closer, and I will never fully hit it, so that I don't beat myself up when I miss the mark.
mm,
I just go back and think, well, why did that slip out today? Why was that so easy?
mm,
What was it? What was going on in my mind? What was it about the conversation? Like, how did that happen? Not in a, oh my goodness, how did that happen? But like really reflect, how did that happen? And
mm.
I have not spent much time reflecting on that because it did literally just happen, in a meeting right before I got on the call with you. So, but it is something that I want to spend some time with. Like I've gotten pretty good at not using ableist language like that. And then there it was. And why, what was it? What was it
Yeah.
in that moment? I don't know. Lost in surprise.
One of the things that I'd love to hear is, when you and I were talking about what did we want to explore together, one of the things that you mentioned was you used to be, or historically were a fairly sarcastic person, which I resonated
Yes.
with because
Yes.
it's something that I sometimes say it's sometimes sarcasm is my love language, but then I realize how sharp it can be. So I'm curious to, paint the picture for us of as best you can in the time we have of your journey. What has your journey been, or what were some of those key moments in your journey that took you perhaps from I'm making an assumption here, but
Mhm.
perhaps from a place of maybe not being as intentional, maybe not being as curious, maybe, not slowing down enough. And right, we all of us spend a lot of our time on autopilot. Um, and to where you are now from a standpoint of wanting to be not only for yourself but help others be much more intentional about the world that they create through their words.
Yeah, it's funny when we look back, sometimes it's easy to find those pivotal moments and then
Mm.
sometimes it's not, right? Like the journey is so gradual and it's not like you wake up one day and you say, I am about to go on a journey to become, a person who is no longer relies on sarcasm as a defense mechanism. I mean, to be honest, the sarcasm thing, I didn't even realize until probably in the last year or so, like, oh, I'm I don't think I'm sarcastic anymore. I don't think I'm
Mm.
sarcastic anymore, right? It wasn't something that I was working toward. I think it's a byproduct. I And there are still some pivotal moments,
Mm.
right? I've I've always been interested in justice and equity. Um, and for a long time I came at it from a very uneducated place of privilege,
Mm.
right? Where I could be a good white person. I could be a good um, straight cis woman. I could be a good, all of the privilege that I hold, which is a lot of privilege. Like I could do good. And there was a lot of unlearning there. And I
Mm.
think one of the most pivotal things for me is I was in a fellowship in 2019 and it was the Nexus Fellowship, and it was a fellowship. It was the first time I was ever in a place that was deliberately decolonized. It was created for the people of color and in many ways, specifically the Black people in the room. And it was the first place I'd ever been where my experience was not centered,
Mm.
right? Which was not to say that I wasn't welcomed or that I wasn't loved or that I wasn't, fully included, but my experience wasn't centered. And I went into that fellowship. It was a year-long program. And I went in, and the question that I went in was, what is my role as a white person in doing this kind of good work? And then when I got there, I realized, no, the question is, who am I? What does liberation
Mm.
look like for me?
Mm.
And when I experience liberation, then I'll know how I'm supposed to show up in the world, and then that will be the work that I'm supposed to do. And then for whatever reason, because I think all of us are called to different there's so much work to be done. I think we're all called to different things. And for whatever reason, the thing that I'm really called to is to mess up publicly, like share all of the,
Mm.
I think because I hold so much privilege, I don't want to be somebody that goes around like sharing the answers because there's nothing I can say that, a Black woman hasn't said better, right?
Mm.
But I know the thing that I know, my lived experience is I know how to be, specifically around anti-racism, I know how to be a white person that is constantly bumping up against the white supremacy that's inside of me. That's the thing that I've got. That's my lived experience that I can share. So, it helps that I'm an extrovert and I've always shared all of my experiences with everybody. And I've always been, telling my life story to the person behind me in the grocery store line. Made it a little bit easier, but I think that it is more than, oh, and so therefore I became careful about language. And
Mm.
so
Mm.
not so much sarcasm and now really being intentional about the words that I use. That is a product of, that's like a result of leaning into that liberation and being willing to be vulnerable to myself and then outside of myself. Right? Because you can't really be that vulnerable. Like, you can't be sarcastic and vulnerable in
Mm.
the same moment.
Mm.
I don't think. I can't.
No, I there's oh boy, there's a couple of different paths I'm curious to explore with you. Um, I think I want to talk just sort of briefly about the sarcasm because that's something that I see a lot in the work that we do, or right, sometimes that's just how we interact with people or engage with them, and sometimes there's places of just joking around or loving teases, and then I think it's a worthwhile exploration to go, when does it shift from that to being more defensive? When is it because maybe I am uncomfortable being vulnerable and this is the way that I feel like I can show it that feels safe and protected? And I think, I imagine that there's quite a few people listening who probably resonate with this. And then your comment about how it wasn't necessarily that was your goal, but by becoming more intentional um, and being willing to, leaning into that, yeah, I'm going to publicly own when I mess up. And that's I realized my role, that the output of that was you became even more thoughtful about your language, right? You built those muscles even more. It's so important for white people to have these conversations, right? And one
Mhm.
of the things that I know that I struggled with, and I think I still do sometimes, like I don't think I know, but it's something that I hear. You've just heard recently from a client that we were talking to, is this: I'm so afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so then what happens, specifically in the context of talking about inclusion and racism and anti-racism, and so there's this caution. And so then the default is, I'm just not going to say anything, right? Instead
Mhm.
of leaning into that. And I'd love to explore and unpack that of, you know, uh, understanding that where that comes from, but also why that's actually quite problematic.
Right.
When we're coming from that place of essentially, I'm protecting my comfort, um, instead
At the
of
cost of.
yes, right, at the cost of real harm
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
others. And
Yeah.
I say I want to be a good person and I care about people, and yet the way I'm showing up, the language I'm using, or the conversations I'm avoiding are actually causing harm. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think especially for white people who, were socialized and grew up in the United States. And we talked about this too, right? And like in the Midwest, right? Like the culture of, I can't even remember what you call it, but
I call it
niceness,
violent politeness, but
violent
the
politeness.
niceness, we're going to be
Yeah,
nice.
but I think kind of no matter where you were brought up, there's this idea that, it's not polite to talk about race,
Mm,
right? It's not polite to name the things that are not comfortable.
mm,
And I frankly think that that's a lie of white supremacy,
mm,
right? Because it allows us to center our comfort at the cost of everybody else around us. It's not polite for me to name race. It's not polite for me to name disability. It's not polite for me to name all of these things. Therefore, I get a pass and I don't have to do it. And I can keep moving forward, harming other people, thinking that I'm doing the right thing,
mm,
um, because my comfort is, I'm masking that centering of my comfort with this veneer of politeness and
mm,
niceness.
mm,
Um, I I have a friend one time who said to me, "I'd rather be good than nice." And
mm,
I think about that all the time, right? I would rather be of good character. I would rather be of good competence. I'd rather be good in all the ways that one can be good than nice. And when
mm.
you can be good and nice at the same time, go for it, right? There's no, like, you don't have
Right,
to just be
right,
mean. Like, I don't have to be
right.
nice, right? But if the choice is good or nice, then, go for good. Um, and that fear that you have of saying the wrong thing, you'll say the wrong thing. Like,
Mhm,
we say the wrong thing. A colleague of mine, Claire Haas, who I was actually just speaking with this morning, um, in another context, I heard her say one time, as a white person doing this kind of work, of course I'm going to cause harm. Of course I'm going to cause harm. I am choosing to cause harm in service to liberation and not in service to fear.
mm,
And like that is the best thing, right? The best way to think about it. So I'm not going to stop because I might cause harm. I know I'm going to get it wrong. I know I'm going to mess it up, but I'm going to keep on stepping out there. I'm going to keep making repair where I need. I'm going to keep learning the things. I'm going to get better at this. And the only, like everything else, right? How do you become a good recorder player? It's through practice. How do you become good at anything? It's through practice. So how do you become good at navigating these kinds of conversations and saying the wrong thing less often is by practice. And when you're practicing an instrument and you hit the wrong note, you just keep going, right? And maybe you're doing it in the privacy of your own room, and maybe you're doing it in front of other, family and friends, and maybe you get to the point where you're performing a concert in front of strangers and you still hit the wrong note and you just keep going, right? So you say the wrong thing, you make the mistake, you cause harm, you admit it, you repair you do your part in the repair, and you keep going.
Yeah.
And it happens less often.
Yeah. Or it may become perhaps a little less painful. Not that that's necessarily the goal, but I think anytime, it's one of the things when we talk about, I feel like I'm a broken record, is generally speaking about relationships, right? Regrettable events are inevitable. We're going to have these moments, but then especially looking at it through the lens of being a white person and working to explore, how can I show up in a way that it truly is inclusive? How can I understand the biases I hold, whether they're conscious or unchecked or unconscious, right? Just like you checked me earlier. It's like, well, that's like, I'm going to have to get curious about that. Like there was potentially something in my brain. And I think about my good friend, Stephanie Chin, who's been such an important person in my life personally, but also in doing this work from a standpoint of how can I show up more powerfully? How, like, who am I? Who do I want to be? And, and that's the thing that she constantly reminds me is, yeah, Sarah, you're going to mess up. But it's in those moments where either when you realize it or somebody helps you realize it, and it's not it's not comfortable because we all, I shouldn't say we all, but many of us, like you said earlier, we want to do good. We want to show up. I think of myself as a very open person, and yet there's so much, conditioning and cultural conditioning that is within me and untangling that I don't even maybe realize is impacting how I'm showing up. But in that moment of, for me, it's that, it's I want to get real curious. So instead of shutting down and shutting up, I want to get real curious about, why is that so uncomfortable for me? And also, and why is it also true, the feedback that they gave me? Or like if somebody calls me out or they offer a perspective or whatever the case is that's not always it for me anyway. It's not comfortable, but it's the, I just posted, shared this on a LinkedIn post, and it's I have it written at my desk, which is so Minda Hart's, someday she's one of my dream guests. I will get her on the show. She wrote the book, The Memo, and The Right Within. And The Right Within really explores this idea of healing from racial trauma. And one of the things she shared during an event that I was able to participate in was, no one will benefit from your caution, but so many can benefit from your courage. And that just, I have a whole, I have goosebumps. I have sort of a pit in my stomach. I have all of those emotions as I think about that. And as we think about how do we show up more powerfully, not just for ourselves, but for other people, it is going to take some courage. But again, to realize that to not do so, there is a cost others are paying in really significant ways.
Yeah. I heard Brene Brown one time say, if you think you're being brave and you're not being vulnerable, then you're not really being brave, because bravery is vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I think you're right about the discomfort. And I think that gets back to, what we were talking about earlier. This right to comfort is something that white supremacy culture and all of the things, patriarchy, capitalism, all of that tells us that we have this right to comfort, and that we don't sort of step outside of ourselves and think about how uncomfortable other people are around us all the time because our comfort is so important. And I think learning how to be comfortable with that discomfort is a really important skill. To be like, oh, there's this thing in the pit of my stomach again. Hello, friend.
Yeah.
What does this mean? What am I going to learn here? What do I need to, what do I need to repair? What do I need to think about? Where should my curiosity take me? And I think, for me, there have been times in my life that I realized that I've gotten pretty comfortable, but like in the surroundings that I'm in, I have created a world where I can be, a pretty good, there again, like good white person, good anti-racist, whatever. And yeah, sometimes it's like, well, how can I chase discomfort? Because if I'm too comfortable, I'm missing something, or I'm either missing something that's right in front of my face, or I'm not stepping into possibilities. And I don't want to be a person that doesn't step into possibilities.
What a powerful reflection for us and for those who are listening to think about, that idea of chasing discomfort, and where might you be comfortable doing that, and where might you not be comfortable doing that, and then to get curious about both of those. And because this episode hasn't launched, but you will be coming after the interview that I did with my friend Paul, and one of the things we talked about was that voice in your head of, oh, I see you, friend. Like, so how you were saying, I wanted to connect back of just that acknowledgement of I see you, and when we're working to be, brave, courageous in our relationships, in our work, how we show up in the world, when we're talking now specifically through a lens of really stepping into what does it look like for me to be anti-racist. Again, I go back to some wisdom that I feel like is burned into my heart in a good way, but from my colleague and friend Stephanie. And one of the things she said is, when you start really doing the work of thinking about this, of exploring it, of showing up differently, when you hit moments where you want to retreat, she's like, that's actually where you're probably making a difference in a way beyond just internal thinking and reflection. And that's something that I think about a lot of that. And I mean, through this work, but then also in other elements of my life of, am I leaning into those possibilities into at a level that makes me go, oh shit, this is kind of scary, or, oh, I'm not sure. Or am I, and realizing that, no, that's actually where not only potentially can I make the most impact in the world around me, but I can make the most impact for myself, right? To change that internal landscape so that I can show up differently.
Yes to all of that. A thing though that I was thinking about while you were talking is this idea of comfort and safety. And so I think a lot of times white supremacy tells us that if we're uncomfortable, that means that we're unsafe. And that's not true. And so there is a way in which we need to really get clear on what the difference is between discomfort and lack of safety. Because if it is about discomfort, then we need to move forward and not retreat. Sometimes it actually is a lack of safety, and then the response has to be different.
Yeah.
Right. But I would suggest that, especially when it comes to anti-racism and things around race, for those of us who identify as white, most of the time it's going to be discomfort and not safety.
Yeah.
Right. If it is about race. Right. And again, I hold a lot of privilege, but for people who are white, who are gender nonconforming or trans or disabled or, other members of other oppressed groups, then there is a difference between, there are times that you're really not safe, and think about it, because you're still white And so there's still an awful lot of times where you might be thinking that you're not safe because you're used to being not safe in a lot of spaces, and that's
Mm,
legitimate.
mm,
If it's about race, probably even still, it's discomfort.
mm. I think I'm going to be chewing on that a lot. I, yeah, of just how you teased out the difference, and also, I'm also thinking through the lens of well, sort of flipping it a bit, because I know many of the people who listen are either in positions of formal authority and power, right? Whether that's from an HR perspective, another type of manager perspective, and also thinking about, when is it unsafe for someone else, that's more than just, oh, it's uncomfortable. That sometimes people can over rotate. When we do the work from elephants of like, oh, we just need
Mhm.
to call it out. And it's like, well, no, sometimes it really isn't safe.
Mhm.
It really isn't. And that, I think that's what a powerful reflection to go, is it that I'm unsafe, or is it that I'm uncomfortable?
Mhm.
And again, what's the cost of me staying in my comfort to other
Right.
people, to me, and what's the benefit of the courage? One of the gifts that you gave me that I want to share with the group, because it's something I feel like I've shared a bunch of times with my own clients or colleagues or friends, is when we talk about um, wanting to show up, and wanting to show up differently than maybe what the white dominant white supremacist culture has shaped for us. And I want to call this out real quickly, because I will attach in the show notes some resources for people who maybe be unfamiliar with this phrase or this terminology or the concept behind it. So I'll share some resources in the show notes, because I know, I mean, even just that, owning and acknowledging that there is a white dominant culture, right? The white sort of supremacist culture way of being is very present, even if it's not always conscious. So I wanted
Mhm.
to name that for a second, but um, but related to that, when you and I were doing work together, we I came to you in a moment, very very tender moment. So I'll tell the story a bit. Just um, the world was in chaos because of the pandemic,
Yep.
and and I was getting all these messages about how I should run the company, how I should show up for people. And I'll never forget, you and I had a conversation, and I remember just being parts afraid, and also worried of, what if in wanting to build a company that's truly good for humans and all humans, what if I'm actually too empathetic, was the question that I asked. And Anne paused, and then she said, well, what would it look like to be too empathetic? But it was such a powerful moment for a couple of reasons. One, through the lens of the words that I was using. Two,
Mhm.
through the lens of all the rules I had been taught about what it looks like to be a successful, quote unquote, business owner. Again, through a very, white dominant lens of, well, you have to be tough, and you have to be achievement oriented, and you have to have the sense of urgency, and you can't have emotions in the workplace, and perfectionism, right, at all cost. And, the list goes on. And unpacking that with you was so powerful. And um and but but one of the things in exploring that was realizing that, well, no, like, there isn't such a thing as being too empathetic, because it doesn't mean that I won't hold people accountable. It doesn't mean that we won't work through if there's challenges. But then you explain this garden metaphor, and do you remember the like tangling of the roots, and it
Oh,
isn't enough?
yes, I
Do
use
you
that all the
remember
time.
that enough to be able to share that in your words?
Oh, sure,
Um,
'cause I this is something I share all the time. So I think of it as when I think about, like, white supremacy culture, white dominant culture, I think of it as, like, I'm a garden, right? And the flowers or the plants or the whatever it is that's planted there, because I think for each of us it looks something different, but that's the true me, who I really am, who I'm meant to be, who I want to be in the world. And all of these plants have roots, right? And these roots go down and they get nurtured, and I can grow and I can flourish. And then there's white supremacy culture, which are like the weeds in the garden, but the weeds go really deep, and the weeds are woven through and around, the roots of the weeds are woven through and around the roots of the plants, right? And so you can't just look at white supremacy and say, boom, I'm gonna yank it out, without doing tremendous damage to the plants, to who you truly are, right? So it's this unwinding and unwrapping and really carefully separating so that you can then get rid of it. And they're in deep. They're in deep. There's a saying that people will that you may have heard about how, we're like fish in the water, and the water around us is white supremacy. And I heard someone recently say, no, actually, we're the water.
Mm. Mm.
And so these, like, I don't believe that I'm going to be able to get all of these roots out in my lifetime, but that's what my life's work is to just keep, it'll get easier, right? I get more nimble at doing it. I get rid of some of the bigger ones that were really clogging things up, so that now I can get, to the little ones that I never would have noticed before. But that really delicate separating the roots of white supremacy culture from the roots of who I truly am at my most liberated. It's hard, and it's delicate and nuanced, and how weeds just keep growing, right? So like you have to keep doing it to get to a point where you're doing it faster than they can grow back.
Yeah. It's that like micro incision over and over and over. And, you said earlier, I want to be someone who leans into possibilities. And I think that's such an important practice of what, something we talk about a lot within our team, or even in the work, or even just reflection. Nick and I, we talk about this, are these rules and roles that have been created for us of what it means and what it looks like, and whether that's what it means and what it looks like to work. What does professionalism look like? What does a relationship look like? What is my role as the wife? What is his role as the husband? And how there are things that whether they were told explicitly or implicitly or just conditioned, that limit us and who we can be, that flower of who we are. And I mean, and this may seem like a benign exploration for some people, but it was really quite powerful for me and I want to share it from a standpoint of, how do we get curious about who are we really? How do we get curious about how do we really want to show up, and what are those rules and what are those roles that have been placed on us, and how do we untangle from that to say, no, this is who I am and this is how I want to show up, and that isn't the only way. There's lots of ways. For me it was and anyone who knows me knows that I, for many, many years, operated at one speed, like unhealthily, at an unhealthy pace, right? And I wanted to get better at resting, and it wasn't enough to say, oh, I just should nap more. I wanted to examine my relationship with rest, and I realized that, right, like so much of the culture is hustle and sense of urgency and grind and all of this, that even though I valued rest, or I thought I valued rest, I clearly didn't, because I wasn't doing it. Or I knew intellectually how important it wasn't until I took the time to, and this wasn't a single sit down conversation. This was, sort of over a period of months. And I think I still have moments where it's like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, hello, I see you. I see you, voice that tells me I need to hustle. I see you, voice that tells me I need to, be scaling and building my company at, an incredible rate. But that willingness to get real curious about, like, man, what have I been told, or how have I been shaped related to how I think about how I should show up in the world. And you know, that you know, that metaphor for me of that garden, and how do we really get, like, explore the tangling and the untangling, and that it's not just as simple as saying, yeah, I want to do this, or I want to show up in this way. It's, oh, there's a lot that's going to hold me to continue showing up in a way that might be different. And you use the word liberation, and that's such an intentional word, I know, for you especially. And I wanted to get curious about that with you. When you think of liberation, what does that mean for you, and what could that mean for our audience?
Yeah, I mean, so when I'm thinking about liberation, it's that thing that you just talked about, right? It's who am I really without
Mm,
the trappings of what white supremacy or white dominant culture have said, without the trappings of what patriarchy says, without the trappings of what capitalism says, without all of the societal trappings. Who am I? Who was I meant to be?
mm,
Who do I want to be? What does that person look like? And then how do I lean into that and give up those other things? And it's not easy, right? Like society tells you, right? Society tells you should be scaling your company and you should be successful. And society says that we should be doing all these things, and they don't all serve us.
mm.
And in fact, they often, like, not only don't serve us, but actively harm us.
Yeah.
And so liberation is leaning, leaning out of those things and into what's really true. And I think I'm going to now add to my garden metaphor, which I've never done before.
Mm.
But when you
This
were
is a world
talking about
premiere.
rest,
Sorry.
there we go.
Continue on. Yeah.
Like, right. So like we're getting rid of the things, right? We're untangling, but we also have to be nurturing
Mm,
the plants that belong there.
mm,
Right. And so I think when I think about liberation, it's the untangling, but it's also the nurturing. What am I pouring in?
mm.
So that the garden grows beautiful, healthy plants that are the plants that are supposed to be there.
Mm. You know, as you were talking, you know, what was also coming up for me is, and then, you know, how can I, what role, you know, like, I'm thinking, what role can I play, but how can I be even more intentional about supporting other people on their journey of untangling and discovering and redefining? And what, I don't think I've ever shared this with you, but um, when I first started my coaching journey, right, they wanted us to come up with, like, what's your purpose, what's your mission,
Mm-hmm.
and what came up for me was the idea that I used the metaphor of an acorn. That if you think of a tiny little acorn,
Mm-hmm.
every single acorn has within it the greatness of an oak tree, as long as
Mm-hmm.
it's nurtured. And,
Yeah.
and for me, it's, how can I be the sun that nurtures the acorn to become the great oak tree it was meant to be?
Oh, that's beautiful.
And so as you're talking, I feel very quite emotional as you were talking about that, of, the discomfort of untangling is really important. And sometimes the discomfort of nurturing is equally important. I boy, I also, I feel like all of these conversations, I always have moments where I'm like, and just imagine a world
Mm-hmm.
where people could be liberated to be their true selves, to be able to show up in the way that uh, of who they are, to create systems and structures that are maybe, or that are different than what we have to, and I, when I've experienced that for myself, or I see that maybe in my husband or my friends or, family members, it's overwhelming. And but the weeds are still really, they're really tight in our world, right? Like, But I just sit there and go like, God, imagine what would be possible. Imagine what would be possible if everyone was able to lean into their true self, that they were able to bring their full gifts forward, that they were able to, be the humans they deserve to be. It's the world I want to live in.
Yeah. So that's the world we work to create.
Yeah.
Right. And you and I, we're not going to change the entire world, but we can change part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
We can change the world that's right around us.
Mm-hmm. It's a professor of mine once said, be the daisy in the onion patch, because daisies multiply fast. So how do you, be the daisy in the onion patch?
And I think, the reality is we didn't get here in a generation.
Right.
So
right.
we're not going to solve the whole thing, in our lifetime. I think a lot about like the people that came before us and the people who will come after us. And I think a thing that motivates me as I think about what kind of ancestor I want to be. Like, what's the legacy? Because it's not all going to get solved now.
Yeah, and not to let that. Sometimes I think when situations can feel complex or overwhelming, or that we won't see it done in our lifetime, right? That can also be something that can go, well, I'm going to retreat into what's comfortable and good for me. But that reflection question, I'm definitely going to think on it, and would invite our listeners to think about that idea of, what's your legacy? What kind of ancestor do you want to be? What are the stories that, whether it's your grandkids or whatever. And I would invite, one of the things that I want this to be, obviously you and I are having a conversation, but I also want to open it up to those of you who are joining us. So if you've reflected on that question of what kind of ancestor do I want to be, and you want to share it with Anne and I, please do. And I will make sure that I share that with her. I mean, you could share it on social media, or you can email us at podcast@sarahnollwilson.com. But I would love to, hear and hold space for your journey of reflecting on that. And there's so much. This is one of many conversations. And it was such an important one. And I'm so grateful for the role that you've played in my life to help me see the weeds that aren't serving me and the people around. And you were, so for those of you who are listening, you hear us talk a lot about how we want to build a company that works better for humans and a very human first. And there was a real time of transition in 2020. And Anne, you played such an important role in me owning the flower I was, right?
Oh, thank you.
So thank you for that. And the ripple effect was significant, probably more than you'll ever know, but I'll continue to try to tell you. So as we wind down, there's always one question that I invite our guests to think about and reflect, and invite you at home to think about as well. The whole podcast is about conversations we have with ourselves and with other people. So I'm curious to know, Anne, what was a conversation that you've had, whether it's with yourself or with someone else or both, that was transformative?
So before I answer that, I just want to say, all of the lovely things you said about me and the relationship that we have and impact. I just want to say likewise, I value your friendship, and the conversations that we have always leave me with something to chew on and something to think about and contemplate. Anytime I think about how to get curious about something, I think of you. So thank you for that. A transformative conversation. I shared this with you actually on Twitter recently, and so this is the most recent one that is coming to mind. I had to have a conversation recently with someone, and I was not looking forward to it, and I had a lot of preconceived ideas about where this conversation was going to go and what this person was thinking or feeling, and I I realized I was feeling incredibly judgmental, and I thought, well, this this isn't going to go well, right? And so I channeled some Sarah, and I thought, how can I lead with curiosity into this conversation? And I led with curiosity, and it was such a lovely conversation. And I don't believe that this person felt judged, because I was no longer judging. I was no longer judging, and I was just really curious and open to hear what they had to share. And I don't think that that conversation was necessarily transformative, but the conversation that I had with myself prior to that, my preparation for that conversation was transformative. In, that was the thing in action, right? That was the stopping beforehand and thinking, how am I feeling? How am I going to show up in ways that are not aligned to who I am or to who I want to be? And how can I shift that and show up in the way that I want to be? And how might that change the conversation? And wow, didn't it? I might have other examples that are
No, I think
more magical, but
no,
that's the one that I
but
had just recently.
I think that's such a beautiful example, and that's a theme. That's a theme that certainly is coming through in a lot of our conversations with people, is that power of the pause, the power of preparing, and preparing doesn't necessarily go, well, I'm going to script it out and I know what I'm going to say or whatever. It's anchoring yourself, and how do I want to show up in this moment? Because again, boy, do we spend a lot of time on autopilot. I mean, there's times where my husband and I can have a whole conversation. I'm like, I'm sorry, what did you, what did you say? So I love that. I love that example. And if people want to connect with you, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
The best way is probably Twitter. That is where I spend most of my social media time. My handle is Ann Tomk, ANNETOMK, and then I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me at Ann Tomkinson. I haven't made space in my life for Instagram or TikTok or any of the other things going on.
So much time.
If you want me, find me on Twitter. That's where I am most likely to be.
Thank you, Ann, so much. I think everyone needs an Ann in their life, somebody that they can go to and say, that didn't go how I wanted, or I'm not sure how to navigate this, or here's what I'm struggling with. And to have that person who's willing to see the discomfort and to push you despite of it. So, Ann, thank you so much for joining us today.
This was a delight and an honor, honestly. I'm loving every episode that I have heard of the podcast so far. So honored to be part of it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Conversations on Conversations. I know that I enjoyed, and I hope you did as well, talking to Ann Tomkinson as we explored, difficult conversations around the words that we use, the rules and roles that influence us, the role that a white dominant, white supremacist culture plays, and how ultimately we can start to liberate ourselves to be who we truly were meant to be and to create an environment where others do the same. I have a list of all the things I'm going to hold on to, but a couple of things that are resonating deeply for me is, first, that the idea of, no, I'm going to name my mistakes out loud to normalize that. I think that that's something that I do, but I think that's something I want to become. I don't think I want to become more intentional about. That idea of the difference between comfort versus safety. And again, that idea of, what does liberation look like? What does it look like to be our true full self? So I'm so grateful. And as I mentioned in the conversation, we were referencing this idea of white supremacist, white dominant culture, and we'll add some resources for those of you who might be unfamiliar, or maybe you're uncomfortable hearing that language. We invite you to get curious, to learn more about it, and also to get curious about where does that come from, and what's that discomfort for you. I just want to thank you for being here. If you are interested in more information on holding deeper, more meaningful conversations with others, or if you'd simply like to reach out, you can connect with me on sarahnollwilson.com and my colleagues. You can also connect with us on social media. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search Sarah Noll Wilson. Also, you can pick up a copy of my book, Don't Feed the Elephants, wherever books are sold. If you have been joining us for a while, or if this is your first episode and you like what we're doing and it's resonating for you, we invite you to support us in a couple of different ways. The first is you can become a patron of the show and go to patreon.com/conversations on conversations, where your financial support not only sustains this podcast, and 100% of the proceeds are used to pay the amazing team and staff. You can also get access to some pretty great benefits like unique swag and Patreon-only content events. If you have questions with us, want to share what resonated, or you just want to send pictures of a flower that represents who you are at your best self that I can share with Anne, please shoot me an email at podcast@sarahnollwilson.com. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter at Convos on Convos. Please take time to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. This is, listening is a gift, and taking that step further helps us in a variety of ways for us to continue this work and to expand it. So, and if you loved what we're doing, we would be honored to have a 5-star rating. Also, if you're enjoying the show and you think others might too, help us spread the word. Whether you want to tell a friend about it, you want to post about it on social media, if you want to start an AOL chat group exploring it, we invite you to do that. We want these conversations to reach as many people and as many ears as possible. So helping people find the podcast is another great way to show your support. Finally, I just want to give a heartfelt thank you to our incredible team who makes this podcast possible, to Drew Noll and Nick Wilson for editing and producing the show, Olivia Reinert, who helps with transcribing, and Caitlin Summit Nelson for all of her marketing support. And just one more final thank you to Anne Tomkinson, our guest today, who is an incredible human who is helping me and so many others show up in more powerful ways. And a final reminder that when we can change the conversations we have with ourselves and others, I do believe that we can change the world. So thank you all. Please make sure you get rest and stay rehydrated, and we'll see you again soon.